Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook and I am going to be joined very shortly by Joshua Espinoza, and his album Songs from Yesterday is out now. The 9 tracks on that album are a reflection of his childhood, growing up, and the power of music to heal and restore. So I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with him. What you're listening to right now is, and I'm going to have to ask him to explain how to pronounce it, but it's Michoacan. So I hope you enjoy listening to my conversation with Joshua. So welcome to Harmonious World. I'm joined by Joshua Espinoza, and your album Songs from Yesterday is out very soon. Is that right?
That's right. September 29th.
How brilliant. So by the time this podcast goes out, it'll be there. And obviously I have a global audience, so some people will want to stream it. Some people in the US might want to come and see you. So we'll talk about that as well.
Great.
So Songs from Yesterday, it sounds like it's very autobiographical. Is it?
Yeah, I would say that it's inspired by my childhood, my memories, music that was important to me growing up. And so maybe not autobiographical in the sense that every piece has to do with a certain instance of my life, but it sort of came about on reflecting, especially with the 2 years that we had to do a lot of reflecting and inward focused thoughts of the pandemic. A lot of these pieces sort of came about from that sort of inward reflection.
Right. Okay. So where was growing up for you?
I grew up between 2 places in the southern United States. So I spent my early childhood in southwestern Virginia in kind of a small foothill town called Martinsville. And then the rest of my sort of starting with like 3rd grade of elementary school was about an hour and a half south of there in North Carolina, Greensboro, North Carolina. So a lot of my time as a child was spent outside playing in the woods. There's a lot of natural beauty there, kind of rolling foothills. And one of my pieces from the album called Appalachian Wanderer is dedicated to my mom. She grew up in that region of Virginia, just in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, which are part of the Appalachian Mountains. And so that piece is sort of dedicated to her and sort of reminiscent of my own time spent like playing in the woods, climbing these big hills, and sort of an autumnal journey through the woods of the foothills.
Right. One of my earliest memories of film is a Laurel and Hardy, and I don't know why, but the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia was a song they sang at the time, and so I have, every time I hear those words, I have an image in my head of Laurel and Hardy in those hills.
Oh, really?
It's amazing. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much rich culture in that part of Virginia. And while, my piece doesn't necessarily quote any Appalachian folk music per se, I did write it with that in the back of my head. So the primary melody of that is very folk-like. It's an original melody, but my idea was to sort of draw upon some of those folk aspects, kind of singable, really catchy melodic fragments that sort of make up that piece.
Yeah, and all of the tracks actually are very very melodic, aren't they? There are real tunes there.
Yeah, I would say that like one of my primary goals with anything is to make sure that there is a melody. I'm a big fan of melody when I listen to music. I love lots of other aspects of music, and there's a lot of modern jazz, which is like oriented towards rhythm and sort of like uh, complex rhythmic fragments and fragmentation. And I love that music, but what I really love is when somebody's able to do that and also have a beautiful melodic gesture happening at the same time. And so that's kind of where I am in my own sort of compositional aesthetic. I want to be able to have a beautiful melody, and then I can superimpose that on top of maybe some other um, more complicated rhythmic things going on.
Yeah, right. I was talking to somebody this week about earworms and the way that some melodies just have that thing where they just get into your head and then stay there.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like if, as a composer of any type of music, if you can get one of your melodies into somebody's head and then it gets stuck there, then you've kind of done your job, like
Yeah.
if people can sing along to it in their head, or as they're walking along, days, weeks past when they first heard it, I feel like that's something that's very human and something that sort of like um, that unifies good music across all cultures is that you can hear it in your head even when it's not being played.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started this podcast with, now I'm not going to be able to pronounce it, Michoacan.
Oh, Michoacan.
Michoacan. Okay.
Michoacan.
Yeah, tell me about that, because that's a great track. It really spoke to me in that way that we were talking about melody.
Thank you. So that is dedicated to my dad. He was born in a region of Mexico called Michoacan. Um, and I've never been there personally. At the present moment, it's actually somewhat difficult to travel there as a tourist because of sort of drug cartel related violence and things like that, which is really unfortunate. But um, it's one of the most beautiful places on the planet, from what I've been told and from what I've read. Um, it is surrounded by mountains, and there's beautiful green uh, foothills and lots of really vibrant sort of cultural heritage that is a part of that region. And so I kind of use those stories that I heard my dad tell about his childhood in Michoacan, and wanted to sort of convey this very vivacious, bouncy, joyful feeling in this piece of mine. And like you said, I I wanted to write sort of a rhythmic kind of groove that goes on, and it does. It's funny. It's in 5/4. So boom, dun,
Yeah,
dun, 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 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is like kind of tough for most people to groove to. But on top of this, I place this like kind of soaring, kind of catchy, folky melody that is much easier to grasp onto. And so those two things paired together, I think, create this really kind of bubbly atmosphere. And so I hope that it comes across that this is like a really joyful sort of culture and a sort of vibrancy.
absolutely. And I think 5/4 is fascinating. I given the choice, I will always write or perform in 3/4. There's something about that waltz
Mhm.
feel that really speaks to me. But 5/4 is really interesting because if you think about things like, Dave Brubeck and Take Five, that you kind of sense, even if you don't know anything about music, you kind of sense that there's something strange about it, but it's a good strange.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing is like, I think if you're um, careful about it, you can write a piece in any sort of subdivision, any sort of rhythmic feel, and also like people maybe who are lay listeners or who are not musicians can find a way to connect with it, even though they can't conceptualize that there's 5 beats in every grouping. So that's kind of my goal when I write something in a different, kind of an odd time signature, is I still want there to be something to grasp onto, even if you're not a musician and can't count to 5 over and over again,
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
catch the groupings.
Yeah. Great. Right. At this point in the podcast, I'm going to play a bit from Adrift. Now, that's another one that's the first piece on the album, first track. So tell me about that.
Yeah, Adrift came about during the pandemic, and that first sort of 6-month period where I know a lot of people felt that the beginning of the pandemic was sort of um, a wonderful time because they got a lot of their time back. They were able to sort of focus on some aspects, like some of their artistic pursuits. They didn't feel like they had to go into work every day, so they were able to like read books and like absorb some things that normally wouldn't happen. That was kind of not the case for me. I get a lot of energy from playing music with other people and being around other people, and socializing in that way and making art with friends. And that period of time was kind of dark for me. I had a lot of performances were canceled, meaning that I didn't get to see my trio mates, and we didn't get to play music together. And so I felt a little nebulous, like I didn't know where my direction was. I felt a little directionless because I had all this direction. And so I wanted to convey that feeling in a piece. And so I sat at the piano and started improvising, and I came across this sort of ostinato, is what we would use in the music world, a pattern in the left hand that repeats over and over again. And I thought, well, nothing is more nebulous than never resolving harmonically. And generally in Western music, there's a home bass chord. There's like a chord or a triad where it feels really settled. And I thought, well, you know what? I'm just never going to go there. So instead of ever resolving to the triad, I keep sort of looping this unresolved chord progression. And on top of it, sort of this languid melody that has these big leaps in it, and but never truly resolves the way we would expect it to in Western music. So that piece has this really kind of undulating, weird, floaty feeling to it, and that's where the term adrift comes from. Sort of inspired, like I said, by my own sense of aimlessness in the pandemic. So yeah, I hope it comes across like that. It's not necessarily a joyful piece.
No, I think it's definitely not joyful, but it's almost like bearing your soul.
Yeah, and
We
it's
can
not.
see inside you a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. When I played that piece, and when I play it still, I go back to those moments and try to feel what was I feeling like then. I mean, things are much better now. Like I feel much more like I've got some aim to things, with performances coming back and society sort of opening up again. And um, but I still try to go introspective in when I play that piece.
Right. One of the things that I loved about creating this podcast during lockdown was that um, it's almost by chance it's documented the lives of musicians through one of the most difficult times, and yet there has been such an amazing outflowing of creativity that actually acknowledges how difficult it was. Every musician, Friday the 20th of March, everyone was getting emails going, oh yeah, all those gigs you got planned, well, they're not happening. And I think some of us, I mean, in fact, I just got a chill just saying that, because that's exactly what happened, and then there was that whole period of, well, you had that gig cancelled, so a year later it's scheduled again, and then you could do it but half as many people, and social distancing and masks and all of this stuff. And I think it's interesting when we can examine what that meant for us as individuals, and putting it into your album like this, I think, is really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's wonderful that you were able to, like you said, document what was happening in real time and how musicians were thinking about it, um, in that
Yeah.
space. Did you run into anybody who said, "Oh, I was really grateful for the pandemic because it did this X, Y, and Z"?
Interestingly, I have, but only in recent months. It's only very recently where some people have gone, do you know what? I was working on an opera and it gave me the time to sit and just get on with it. And that was great. But that's not the majority of people by any stretch of the imagination. Most of us are breathing a huge sigh of relief now that we can get out and about.
Yeah, yeah,
So I
that's
think,
me.
yeah, absolutely. And I think the biggest thing is that being in a room with people listening to your with your audience listening to your music, because I think technology is a wonderful thing, but you cannot sit at home and live stream your gig and get the same feedback from the audience.
That's very true. And I've honestly noticed that audiences post-pandemic are more appreciative than ever before, are more receptive and more grateful in the live performance situation. Like people say things like, "Oh, this is just so special, like this experience." And it's true. I mean, when you experience music with other people, even strangers, you're surrounded by strangers, but just witnessing people sort of communicating and making art together, and then being surrounded by other people who are appreciating it at the same time, and also taking the time out of their day to say, you know what, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to appreciate art together.
Yeah.
Really, sort of like a magical thing um, that virtual performances will simply never be able to replicate.
No, no, absolutely. Talk to me about your trio.
So yeah, my trio, I mean, these guys are my best friends and my favorite musicians in the entire world to play with.
It's really
Um,
funny because as soon as I asked you that question, your face just lit up with a smile. This is obviously like your happy place with your happy people.
oh, this is totally my happy place. And I love playing music with many different people. Um, sort of the jazz uh, status quo, for instance, or sort of part and parcel to being a jazz musician is jam sessions, right? Getting together with strangers and making music on the spot, which is really sort of a special aspect of being a jazz musician. Um, this happens in folk music and bluegrass and other sorts of um, music cultures that have jam sessions as sort of a part of their culture. Um, that being said, there's something really special about choosing your bandmates and also then building sort of a rapport and building a songbook of music that you play together. And one of the things that I've noticed about when we play together is that every time we play, the pieces grow to a new sort of dimension, um, unpredictably, just because we're all sort of like devoting ourselves to whatever the piece at hand is, and we're not worried so much about like, oh, I haven't played this tune in 3 years. Like when you go to a jam session, you're like, oh, somebody might call a tune that you haven't played in 3 or 4 years, so you're also like kind of in this zone where you're trying to remember how the song goes but also express yourself. But with my trio, we play this music a lot, so whenever we come together, it's sort of like finding the nooks and crannies of these pieces that we know really well, that we've sort of devoted some time to sort of mastering together, so that we can truly um, explore the ins and outs of these pieces and try new things. And it's just really, I mean, it's a thrill, and I can't replicate it in any other way than when I get together with Chris and Jaron. And so it's what I would love to be doing most of my time, is making music with these guys.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me about the album when I listened to it, and I've been listening to it on and off, since I first heard it, and was listening to it just now as we were about to start. There's a classical, presumably you're a classically trained pianist who then went into jazz, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah, you could say it like that. Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. I mean,
yeah. I mean, I think the reality is that most of us start off, there's an assumption that you're going to play classical pieces first. But there's something of that within your playing.
absolutely. I mean, I think you nailed it. Like most pianists start by playing classical music. Um, I was obsessed with classical music when I first started playing the piano, and I would listen and buy every CD I possibly could back when there were CD stores. I would go in with my mom, and she would be in the book section, but I'd be back in the CD section, like with my headphones on, listening to basically every album I could put, and convincing her to get me another CD, to add to my collection. So, by the time I was in high school, I had a collection of probably like 200 classical CDs that I was just kind of obsessed with listening to. Baroque music and romantic music and Rachmaninoff and Debussy and Ravel, and I just loved. I couldn't get enough of it. Um, and then when I was in high school, I sort of had the opportunity to sort of randomly take jazz piano lessons. And until that point, I had never really heard jazz or understood what that word meant, or could probably not even tell you who a jazz musician, like a famous jazz musician, was. But I sort of had this lucky chance of taking jazz piano lessons, and then from that moment when I started taking those lessons, I was kind of hooked on um, the freedom that you get when playing jazz, and um, the sort of expressive possibilities of sitting down and improvising something. I think most musicians, like deep down, desire to create on the spot in the way that improvisers do. For whatever reason, classical music pedagogy has lost some of that sort of improvisational thing. But I was very lucky to have found jazz as sort of my entree into this other world, which is to sit down at the piano without any preconceived notions and just start making music. Um, and so, we term that jazz now. Like that's one of the few improvisational musics that still exist in at least in the Western music world. But I also take so much inspiration from classical composers, classical harmony, classical structure, and sort of borrow from all of these different genres to sort of create what I think is my own unique voice. Um, So,
Yeah.
songs like Appalachian Wanderer are very much inspired by Ravel and Debussy sort of harmonies. Um, but also, there are parts of it that sound a little bit more like McCoy Tyner and sort of modal jazz from the 60s, from the 50s and 60s. Don't Fan the Flame is very like Chick Corea-y, I would say, like kind of inspired by Chick Corea. But then also has some like inner harmonic motion that's very much Baroque. So, I feel like every one of my pieces, like you could look at one measure and be like, oh, well, that looks like Bach, and oh, but that looks like jazz, and
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think although this is definitely a trio album, the piano is sort of front and center, and but you share that stage, but nevertheless there is that sense of it being about all of those pianists that have gone for years before. So it's a really stunning album, so thank
Thank
you for
you.
sharing it.
Oh, thank you so much. I get a lot of inspiration. There's several other young pianists that I get a lot of inspiration from. One of, like, I would say the primary one is Shy Maestro, who performed uh, most famously with Avishai Cohen, the bass player. But
Oh yeah.
if your listeners haven't heard Shy Maestro's self-titled album called Shy Maestro Trio, I mean, it is exactly what we're talking about, like a combination of like classical structure and all these different jazz and world styles kind of blended together in these beautiful compositions that like just literally take you from point A like to point Z all in one composition. And it's just these like incredible musical journeys in each little piece.
Right,
Um,
because I've heard him with Avishai Cohen, but not his solo thing. So his own
and
thing. So okay,
yeah,
I'll definitely try that one.
you must listen to Shy Maestro, and Tigran Hamasyan is another amazing young sort of phenomenal um, piano prodigy who writes these pieces that when you hear it, you say like, oh, he's a jazz musician, but you can't really classify his music as
Right.
jazz even.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not classical either. It's like in this weird nebulous zone.
Where it's just taking the instrument and doing what you can do with that instrument. And that's just
Yeah,
that's what music is about, isn't it, really?
absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh wow. Thank you so much for your time, Joshua. Now, before you go, just tell my audience how they can find out more about you, how they can find out where you're playing, how to get the album, all those things.
Absolutely, sure. Yeah. So the album releases officially on Friday, the September 29th. Of course, it'll be available on all streaming platforms. So Spotify, Apple Music, Deezer. Um, and then I'll also be selling the album physically on CD format on my website, joshuaespinoza.com. And I can ship worldwide. For those listeners who are in the United States, we've got some dates on the East Coast this fall. Most of them are up here in sort of the Northeast region. So Baltimore, Washington, D.C. will play a concert in Sewanee, Tennessee, at the Sewanee Music Festival, and then we'll play outside of Philadelphia in November. In the spring, we're hoping to be down in Florida in January, actually, and then the Midwest, Chicago, Indianapolis, in April of next year.
Right.
And all of our dates are on the website.
Fantastic. That's brilliant. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Hillary. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for joining me for that conversation with Joshua Espinoza. And Songs from Yesterday is out in 2 days. What you're listening to right now is Don't Fan the Flame. So thank you for joining me once more for Harmonious World. Please remember that you can share this with your friends. You can rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. But also you can subscribe. And I am actually developing at the moment some extra little goodies which will be just for subscribers. And I will tell you more about that next time. But if you want to get hold of any of those goodies, it will have to be once you subscribe. So there is a link on the show notes to get a subscription. It will help me to just keep this going. But also you can read some of my album reviews, which are on my blog. So if you just search for Hilary Seabrook blogspot, you should be able to find me, and the links are also in the show notes. But thank you for joining me once more. It means a lot to have all of these downloads. And talking to Joshua just now about why I started doing this, it's just because I think it's one thing that I can do to make a difference to musicians around the world and to audiences who want to listen to music and want to know where they can find some great music. So thank you for joining me and have a great week. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook, and it's a great delight to bring this series of discussions with musicians and composers and writers and all sorts of people to you. Obviously, there's no point in having a podcast if people aren't listening, and I'm very grateful to my listeners for doing so. Thanks also to Joe English for composing and performing this new theme tune. So wherever you get your podcast, you can leave a review. You can share this with your friends and family, either as a link or on social media and that sort of thing. I'd be really grateful for that. Don't forget that you can subscribe now. There's a link wherever you get your podcasts. So have a great week, and please remember why I started this, which is just to try and make the world a little more harmonious. Thanks for listening to Harmonious World.